Imagine a place where the simple act of sitting the wrong way could condemn you to the utter isolation of solitary confinement. A place where meeting a guard's gaze is a punishable offense, and you are compelled to work in absolute unbroken silence for 8 hours a day. This isn't a scene from some dystopian film script. For the men incarcerated within Fuchu, Japan's largest and most notorious maximum security prison, this is the stark, unyielding reality of a regular day. And every rule violation is recorded, punished, and remembered. From the outside, nestled in a quiet, unassuming Tokyo suburb, Fuchu Prison's architecture could almost be mistaken for a city hall or a mundane government building. But do not let its facade fool you. Behind its imposing 18-foot walls lies a world engineered for absolute control, a system so total that it has been both feared and condemned on the world stage for decades. This is the final destination for those Japan deems to have the most advanced criminal tendencies. The hardened repeat offenders, powerful Yakuza gangsters like Kenichi Shinoda, the head of the infamous Yamaguchi Gumi syndicate, and hundreds of foreign nationals. The system has all but given up on ever reforming within Japanese society. The moment you walk through the gates of Fuchu, you cease to be a person. Your name, your history, your identity, it's all stripped away, replaced by a number. You become a cog in a machine built on a single, unbending principle: total, unconditional, and immediate obedience. The prison confines around 1,700 inmates, all of them male, many of whom are staring down long sentences, having been caught in the revolving door of the justice system before. For them, this is the end of the line. In a nation where the recidivism rate has recently climbed as high as 47%, Fuchu is the definitive answer for those who cannot seem to stay straight. It exists not to rehabilitate failure, but to contain it. Upon arrival, every inmate is plunged into a grueling 15-day orientation, a crash course in learning the prison's endless, microscopically detailed rules. Everything, and that means everything, is ruthlessly controlled. How you walk, how you talk, how you eat, how you sit, and even how you are permitted to sleep. The rules are not posted as guidance. They are enforced as traps. If you follow every rule to the letter, you might be rewarded with a few small, carefully rationed privileges. But the slightest deviation, the smallest mistake, can bring down severe and immediate punishment. The prison's formidable reputation is forged in a dark and brutal history. For over 100 years, Japanese corrections were built upon a 1908 penal code, a law that demanded harsh punishment and mandatory arduous labor. That code survived war, occupation, and modernization largely intact. In years past, reports from global human rights organizations painted a truly terrifying picture of life inside Fuchu's walls. Across multiple decades, reports from global human rights organizations painted a truly terrifying picture of life inside Fuchu's walls. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have documented harrowing accounts of systemic violence, with guards repeatedly accused of viciously beating prisoners for the most minor infractions. The United Nations has also cast a critical eye on Japan, censuring its prison system for the use of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, including the devastating psychological toll of prolonged solitary confinement and the use of painful restraining devices. These were not just abstract summaries. They contained chilling, deeply personal accounts of suffering. One report from the 1990s described an inmate allegedly being stripped of his clothing with such force that the fabric ripped, before he was held down and brutally beaten by a group of guards. These punishments were designed to enforce compliance without leaving evidence, Other former inmates have spoken of being forced into leather restraints, pulled so tight they could barely draw a breath, forced to remain standing for hours on end just to survive the ordeal. These stories were what cemented Fuchu's reputation, not as a place of rehabilitation, but as a factory designed to break the human spirit. Fuchu does not just hold criminals, it holds symbols of power, defiance, embarrassment, and international scrutiny. Each inmate represented a different threat to the legitimacy of the system itself. Over the decades, its inmates have reflected the pressures placed on the Japanese justice system itself, from organized crime and political dissent to cases that drew global attention and quiet diplomatic tension. Among the most powerful was Kenichi Shinoda, the head of the Yamaguchi-gumi, Japan's largest Yakuza syndicate. Shinoda is a figure of immense power in the Japanese underworld, having previously served 13 years for the murder of a rival boss with a samurai sword. His more recent 6-year sentence in Fuchu, which began in 2005, was for illegal firearms possession. After one of his bodyguards was caught with an illicit pistol, and Shinoda was convicted of conspiring with him. Fuchu has also been home to notable foreign prisoners. Michael Taylor, a former Green Beret, and his son Peter were sentenced for their roles in the audacious 2019 escape of auto executive Carlos Ghosn. The Taylors pleaded guilty to smuggling Ghosn out of Japan in a large equipment case, an act for which they received a 2-year and a 20-month sentence, respectively. Another American inmate was Richard Hines, convicted of the 2012 murder of Irish exchange student Nicola Furlong in a Tokyo hotel. Hines, a musician who was 19 at the time of the crime, strangled Furlong and was sentenced to between 5 and 10 years with labor, the maximum for a minor in Japan. The prison's history stretches back to a time of intense political turmoil. Before and during World War II, Fuchu was used to detain political dissidents under the draconian peace preservation law. Among them were Communist Party leaders Kyuichi Tokuda and Yoshio Shiga, who were imprisoned for 18 years for their beliefs and were only freed after the war ended in 1945. So, what does a day inside this tightly wound world actually look and feel like? Every minute is accounted for, every movement corrected. It all unfolds with the cold, unforgiving precision of a military operation. At 6:45 a.m., a sharp wake-up call slices through the silence, followed by an immediate roll call. There is no snooze button here. Futons must be instantly and perfectly folded into a precise shape. The cells, already spotless, are meticulously inspected for any sign of disorder. At 7:05 a.m., breakfast is served. It is eaten in complete, unnerving silence. No words are exchanged, no glances shared. From 8 a.m. until 4:40 p.m., it's time for work. For the vast majority of inmates, labor is obligatory. Inside the prison's sprawling workshops, they assemble everyday products like plastic laundry pegs or branded merchandise for famous Japanese baseball teams. For all 8 of those hours, talking is strictly forbidden. Inmates cannot speak to one another, and they are most certainly not allowed to make eye contact with the ever-watchful guards. Any communication must be done through formal, pre-approved hand signals. This suffocating atmosphere of forced silence and rigid posture is a deliberate strategy, intended to instill discipline through the sheer weight of monotony. It is a psychological grindstone. Until recently, inmates were forced to march between locations in rigid, military-style formations, swinging their arms at exact, prescribed angles. That practice has now been abolished, a minor concession in what is proving to be a slow-moving, reluctant shift toward reform. After the workday concludes at 4:40 p.m., dinner is served at 5 p.m., followed by a few hours of strictly controlled free time before the lights go out at 9 p.m. sharp, plunging the entire facility into darkness and silence once more. Yet, even this deeply entrenched system is beginning to show the first small cracks of change. But this is where the narrative becomes more complex. The old visceral image of Fuchu as a place of routine physical torture doesn't perfectly align with what recent visitors have been shown. Carefully managed media tours in 2024 were allowed to depict a prison that was shockingly clean, unnervingly quiet, and relentlessly orderly. One journalist noted the prevailing atmosphere was one of calm and order, observing silent inmates working with a focused, diligent air. There was no overt, obvious violence to be seen. The brutality of the past seemed to have vanished. So has Fuchu genuinely changed its ways? Or has it simply become more adept at hiding its dark side from public view? Consider the claims of slave labor. Michael Taylor, a former Green Beret who masterminded the escape of auto executive Carlos Ghosn and later served time in Fuchu, has been exceptionally vocal about the harsh conditions. He alleged that he developed painful frostbite on his hands from being forced to work without gloves in unheated workshops during the bitter cold of winter. In the summer, he claimed, he suffered from heat stroke. Taylor described his time there as nothing short of torture, a period that included being held in the crushing isolation of solitary confinement for months on end. Prison officials, however, present a starkly different reality. They readily admit that heating and air conditioning are limited, but they attribute this to budgetary constraints, not a deliberate policy of punishment. They insist that climate control does exist in communal areas and the workshops. Their descriptions paint a picture of work areas equipped with seats, cooling fans, and proper safety gear, a world away from the brutal, primitive labor camps of the past. So what is the truth? It appears the nature of punishment at the modern Fuchu has evolved. It may be less about the immediate agony of physical beatings and more about the slow, grinding application of intense psychological pressure. The absolute control, enforced silence, and endless repetitive tasks combine to create an environment designed to deconstruct a person and rebuild them as an automaton. The horror may no longer be the sting of a guard's fist, but the complete and total annihilation of your personal freedom and individual identity. Physical pain ends. Psychological erosion does not. And systems built on control adapt far more easily than the people trapped inside them. Fuchu holds a unique distinction within Japan. It houses the largest population of foreign inmates in the country. As of late 2023, there were approximately 353 foreign prisoners held here, hailing from around 50 different nationalities. These are men like Michael Taylor, the American ex-Green Beret jailed for his role in a daring escape plot, or Richard Hines, an American convicted of murdering an Irish exchange student. To manage the cultural and linguistic complexities, these inmates are often housed in single cells. While that might initially sound like a perk, offering a degree of privacy, it can quickly curdle into a sentence of crushing isolation, especially for those who don't speak a word of Japanese. For many, silence becomes the punishment. The prison does offer some token support, like English and Chinese language radio broadcasts and newspapers. But for many, it remains an experience of profound, inescapable loneliness. But here is the most unsettling twist in this entire story. After more than a century, the system finally changed, not because it succeeded, but because it could no longer defend itself. For over 100 years, Japanese corrections were built upon a 1908 penal code, a law that demanded harsh punishment and mandatory, arduous labor. But a sweeping reform, A new law that went into effect in June 2025 has completely upended that philosophy. Prison work is no longer mandatory. Officially, the new focus is rehabilitation. Unofficially, reform arrived only after the system could no longer defend itself. Mandatory labor has been abolished, replaced with assessments and placement into one of 24 individualized programs, including addiction recovery, therapy, vocational training, and elderly care management. On paper, it is the most humane shift Japan's prison system has ever made. Unofficially, it reads like an admission that a century of silence, forced labor, and psychological pressure did not produce rehabilitation. It produced compliance. These programs include addiction recovery, therapy, extensive vocational training, and even daily care senior programs designed to manage Japan's rapidly growing elderly inmate population. This is a massive shift, especially at Fuchu, where a staggering 22% of the inmates are over the age of 65. In a sign of this new reality, younger inmates are now even being trained to get nursing care qualifications so they can help look after their aging peers. What makes this transition so uneasy is where it is happening. Fuchu is not a pilot program or a soft experiment. It is Japan's largest and most controlled prison. If reform is being tested here, it is not because the system is confident, but because it has nowhere left to hide its failures. Fuchu Prison stands at a crossroads, suspended between a brutal past and an uncertain future. For more than a century, it embodied a belief that discipline, silence, and absolute control could fix what society feared. That belief built a system capable of producing obedience, order, and compliance, but not necessarily rehabilitation. What changed in 2025 was not the architecture, the walls, or the routines. What changed was the story the system could no longer defend. The beatings faded. The labor rules shifted. The silence remained. Physical pain ends. Psychological erosion does not. Today, Fuchu is cleaner, quieter, and more controlled than ever. And that may be the most unsettling part. A system no longer needs visible violence to exert total power. It only needs structure, repetition, and time. Whether this new era leads to genuine rehabilitation or simply a more refined form of control is not a philosophical question. It is being tested right now, behind locked doors, in enforced silence. And the outcome? It will not stay confined to one prison. This investigation continues. If you want to follow where it leads next, you know where to find us.